My attorney called me on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. He never called before 9. I picked up on the second ring, and the first thing he said wasn't, "Hello. Richard, I need you to come in today. Not tomorrow. Today. And please don't tell your wife you're coming." I stood in my kitchen holding my coffee mug, watching the steam curl toward the ceiling. My wife was upstairs getting dressed. I could hear the faint sound of the bathroom faucet running, the familiar creak of the floorboard near the closet. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "I can't explain over the phone. Just come in. Before noon if you can." I said I would. I hung up. I set the mug down on the granite counter and stared at nothing for a long moment. My attorney had handled my legal affairs for over 20 years. He was meticulous, calm, the kind of man who chose every word carefully. In all that time, he had never once sounded the way he sounded that morning. There was something underneath his voice that I couldn't name right away. Later I would recognize it as fear. I should tell you about my wife before I tell you what happened next. Her name is Serena. I met her 3 years after I lost my first wife, Margaret, to pancreatic cancer. Margaret and I had been married for 31 years. We raised 2 children together, my son, who was living in Portland with his family, and my daughter, who was finishing her residency in Boston. When Margaret died, I genuinely believed that chapter of my life, the chapter about love and partnership and sharing a home with someone, was finished. I was 62. I was tired in a way I hadn't been prepared for. I sold the house Margaret and I had built together and moved into a smaller place near the lake. And I told myself I was fine with the quiet. Serena came into my life through a mutual friend at a dinner party. She was 51, recently divorced, warm in a way that felt effortless. She laughed easily. She remembered small details about things I'd mentioned in passing: the name of my grandson, the town in Ohio where I grew up, the fact that I still drank the same brand of instant coffee my mother used to buy. She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe longer. We dated for 8 months. I introduced her to my children. My son was cordial but reserved. My daughter smiled the way she smiles when she's being polite but thinking something she hasn't decided to say yet. I told myself they just needed time. We married quietly the following spring, just family and a few close friends, at a small vineyard an hour outside the city. My daughter gave a toast that was gracious and measured. My son shook my hand at the reception and told me he hoped I was happy. I remember thinking his emphasis was slightly off, not "I hope you're happy," but "I hope you're happy," as if the happiness were something that required confirmation. Within a year of the wedding, I had updated my estate documents. My financial advisor had been pushing me to revisit them anyway. The old ones still listed Margaret as primary beneficiary, which my attorney had flagged as something that needed to be addressed. So I went in, sat across from him, and we worked through everything methodically. I updated the beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts. I revised the trust. I added Serena as co-trustee. My attorney had a few questions about the co-trustee designation. He wanted to make sure I understood what it meant in practical terms, that she would have equal authority over the trust assets if I became incapacitated, that certain decisions would require her signature. I told him I understood. He made a note, moved on. That was that. Or so I thought. The morning he called me to come in, I drove to his office telling myself it was probably something routine, a form that needed updating, a regulatory change, something procedural that sounded more urgent than it was. I was good at telling myself things like that. I had gotten good at it over the past several months. Because if I'm being honest, there had been things. Small things that I'd been filing away in a drawer in my mind and choosing not to open. The phone calls Serena took in the other room, voice low, that stopped the moment I walked in. The way she had started asking about my investment accounts with a specificity that I initially attributed to her taking an interest in our finances. The morning I found her sitting at my desk with my filing cabinet drawer open, and she said she was looking for the electric bill, and I told myself that was probably true. The way she had started mentioning, with increasing frequency, that my children didn't respect me, that my son had never really accepted the marriage, that my daughter was cold. She said it gently, carefully, the way you say something to someone you're trying to protect. But she said it often enough that it had begun to do something to me, a slow erosion, the way water works on stone. I had pulled back from my son slightly. I had let a few of my daughter's calls go to voicemail when Serena was in the room, because answering them somehow felt like taking a side. I hadn't noticed how far I'd drifted until I was sitting in my attorney's office and he slid a folder across the desk and said, "I need you to look at this carefully." Inside the folder were photocopies of documents. I recognized the trust papers, my signature on the back page, the notary stamp. But as I read through them, something was wrong. There were pages I didn't remember. Addendums. A schedule of assets that included the lake house, which I had explicitly told my attorney I wanted to keep outside the trust. And at the bottom of the amendment page, a second signature line. Signed, notarized, dated 4 months ago. The signature was mine, except I had not signed those pages. I looked up at my attorney. He was watching me the way a doctor watches a patient reading a difficult diagnosis. "I've been practicing law for 38 years, he said quietly. "I've seen document fraud twice in my career. This is the third time." He paused. "The notary stamp on that amendment, I ran it. The notary's license was suspended 8 months ago. It's a forgery." The room was very still. "How did you find this?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to me, like it was coming from slightly outside my body. He told me that he had been preparing to transfer the lake house title as part of a separate transaction, nothing to do with the trust, and when he pulled the trust records to cross-reference, the amendment appeared in the file. He hadn't put it there. His office hadn't processed it. Someone had filed it directly with the county recorder's office using a title company he'd never heard of. "Who would have access to the original trust documents?" he asked. I knew the answer before I finished processing the question. I drove home in a state that I can only describe as a kind of cold clarity. Not panic, not rage. Something more like the feeling of stepping outside after a long time indoors and realizing how different the air is, how differently you can see things when you're no longer standing in the same room. I did not go inside right away. I sat in the car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes, staring at the front door. The house that Margaret and I had never lived in together, I'd bought it after she died. A fresh start, no memories embedded in the walls. I thought about what my attorney had told me before I left his office. He had a contact at the county. He had already started making calls. He wanted me to say nothing to Serena until he knew more. He wanted 48 hours. I went inside. Serena was in the kitchen, slicing fruit. She smiled when she saw me. "How was the errand?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "Just a signature on some paperwork." She nodded and went back to the cutting board. I watched her for a moment. The ease of her, the way she moved in my kitchen like she had always been there. I thought about the first night she had stayed over, how she'd made coffee the next morning and known exactly where everything was, and I had thought at the time that she was just observant, just comfortable, just the kind of woman who adapted quickly. I was very tired of telling myself things. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. My attorney called me on a burner phone he'd had his assistant buy. I drove to a gas station 3 miles from home to take the calls, telling Serena I was picking up groceries. On the second call, he told me what he'd found. The title company that had filed the fraudulent amendment was registered to a shell LLC. The LLC had been formed 14 months ago. The registered agent was a woman named Patricia Holloway. My attorney's contact had run her through the state business registry. Patricia Holloway was the maiden name of Serena's younger sister. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station and looked at the sky through my windshield and thought about everything I knew and everything I hadn't let myself know. But that wasn't the worst of it. The amendment wasn't the endgame. My attorney explained it to me methodically, the way he explains everything, walking me through it like a blueprint. The lake house had been moved into the trust via the forged amendment. The trust had a co-trustee provision, Serena. The next step, he believed, would have been a petition to have me declared partially incapacitated, which would have given Serena sole authority over the trust. There was already an appointment on the books which I hadn't made with a geriatric psychiatrist. My attorney had found it in the county's public medical scheduling system through a contact he wouldn't name. The appointment was in my name. The referral had come from a doctor I'd seen once, 2 years ago, for a routine physical. Someone had been building a case, quietly, methodically, for over a year. I asked my attorney if he thought Serena had done this alone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think so. The LLC has a secondary filing agent. I'm still running it down. But Richard, the person who submitted your referral to that psychiatrist, It was filed through your primary care physician's patient portal. Someone had your login credentials. There was only one person I had ever shared my patient portal credentials with. My son had set up the account for me 2 years ago when I'd been in the hospital for a minor procedure. He'd created the login, walked me through it, and suggested I write the password in my address book, which was what I did because I was 64 years old and not ashamed about it. I felt something shift in my chest, an old familiar pain, the kind you feel when something you don't want to be true keeps getting truer. My attorney wanted me to wait. He said he needed more before we went to anyone. He said acting too early would give them time to destroy evidence. I am not a patient man by nature. I built a manufacturing business from a single warehouse to 11 facilities over 30 years. I made decisions quickly, and I made most of them correctly, and the ones I got wrong I corrected without spending too much time feeling sorry about them. But I sat with this for 4 more days, because my attorney asked me to, and because in 38 years, he had never once steered me wrong. On the 5th day, he called me to come back in. He had everything. The LLC had a second signatory. The secondary filing agent was my son's wife, who had a professional background in title insurance. She knew exactly how to structure a fraudulent filing to pass initial review. The forged notary stamp had been reproduced using a seal she had purchased through a prop supply company, a legitimate purchase, untraceable without the connection. What they had planned, laid out across the documents my attorney had assembled, was precise and patient. Serena would gain sole trustee control through the incapacity petition. My son's wife would facilitate the asset transfer through the shell company. The lake house, which was worth $2.3 million, would have been liquidated within 60 days. My retirement account's beneficiary, already updated to Serena, would transfer on death. The total they stood to split was somewhere north of $4 million. My son was not a signatory on anything. My attorney said that might mean he didn't know the details, or it might mean he was careful. I didn't know which possibility was harder to hold. My attorney had already contacted a fraud investigator at the state attorney's office, a woman he'd worked with before. She wanted to meet with me. She said the case was strong, the forged documents, the Shell LLC, the fraudulent medical referral, the suspended notary. She said we could move within the week. I want to tell you that I went home that evening and felt righteous, that I was simply angry and determined, the way you're supposed to feel in these moments. But what I actually felt was a kind of grief that I hadn't felt since the morning Margaret took her last breath. A different shape of grief, not for what I had lost, but for what had never been real to begin with. For every meal I'd shared with Serena, for every conversation, for the way she'd held my hand at my granddaughter's birthday party, and I had thought, this is what the rest of my life looks like. And I had been grateful. I thought about my son, his hand on mine at my wedding. I hope you're happy, whether that had already been guilt or simply a man watching something he didn't know how to stop. I called my daughter that night. It was the first real conversation we'd had in months. She answered on the first ring. "Dad," she said, and the way she said it, not surprised, not wary, just steady, made something in me come loose. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is something she learned from Margaret. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds, and then she said, "I need you to promise me you're going to let the attorney handle the legal side and not go over there tonight." I told her I promised. "I also need you to hear me say that I have been scared to tell you this for over a year," she said, "because every time I tried to bring anything up, you got distant, and I didn't know how to reach you anymore." She paused. "I'm sorry I stopped trying." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. We talked for 2 hours. It was the longest we'd spoken in years, longer even than the night Margaret died, when we'd sat in a hospital corridor together and said the kinds of things that don't get said when everyone is fine. The state attorney's fraud investigator moved quickly. Warrants were executed on a Thursday morning. Serena was at home when they arrived. My attorney had arranged for me to be elsewhere at his office, with 2 witnesses present, establishing that I had known nothing until 5 days prior. The investigators took the computers, the filing records, the communications. Serena, according to the investigator's report, was initially very calm. Then she asked for a lawyer. Then she was not calm. My son's wife was taken in for questioning separately. She retained counsel within the hour. Her attorney released a statement the following week saying she had been acting on her husband's instructions and had believed the documents to be legitimate. The investigation into my son's direct involvement was ongoing. I won't tell you I handled all of it with grace. There were days in that period that I don't want to account for. I moved back into the lake house, which remained legally in my name, the fraudulent amendment, having been voided by the county recorder once the forgery was established, and I sat on the back porch some evenings and looked at the water and felt the specific loneliness of a man who has been foolish in a way that can't be entirely separated from grief. Because I think I had wanted Serena to be real. I think I had needed her to be, more than I'd admitted to myself. And the wanting had made me careless in ways I wasn't accustomed to being careless. My daughter flew in and stayed for 10 days. She slept in the guest room and made coffee every morning and sat with me on the porch in the evenings. She didn't try to fix anything or explain anything or make me feel better in ways that would have required pretending. She just stayed. That was the thing I needed most and couldn't have asked for. And she gave it without being asked, the same way her mother used to. The trial began 8 months after the arrests. The case against Serena was built on 3 primary counts: wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy. The forged documents were presented as Exhibit A through F. The Shell LLC records, the communications between Serena and her sister, the fraudulent medical referral, all of it was introduced methodically. Serena's defense argued that she had been acting on advice she'd received from a financial consultant and had not understood the legal implications. The jury took 11 hours. They came back with guilty on all 3 counts. Her sister, the one whose maiden name was on the LLC, pleaded to a lesser charge before trial and received probation with conditions. My son's wife was charged with 1 count of document fraud. She pleaded guilty. She received a suspended sentence and 2 years of supervised probation. My son was not charged. The investigators found no direct evidence linking him to the execution of the fraud. Whether he knew and looked away, or whether he was kept deliberately at arm's length by his wife and Serena, I cannot tell you with certainty. What I can tell you is that he came to see me the week after the verdicts, alone, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table and said very little for a long time. Then he said, "I should have told you I had a bad feeling. From the beginning. I should have said it directly instead of just—" He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at my son. He was 52 years old. He had his mother's eyes in my jaw and the particular expression of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and just put it down. "Did you know?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "With Karen, with what she was involved in, I found papers once. I asked her, and she told me it was a separate business matter, nothing to do with you. And I—" He exhaled slowly. "I didn't push, because I didn't want to know. And I've been trying to figure out if there's a version of that that isn't what I think it is, and I can't find one. There are moments in a life when you understand that forgiveness is not a feeling but a decision, a practical one, made not because the other person deserves it, but because the alternative is carrying something that will damage you more than it damages them. I don't know if I forgave my son that afternoon. I don't know if that's the right word for what happened between us. But I looked at him, and I remembered the boy he had been before all of this, the kid who used to fall asleep on my shoulder at baseball games, who called me the night his first daughter was born, voice cracking, saying, 'Dad, she's here. She's perfect.' And I thought, this is still that person. Complicated and flawed and still that person. I told him to come back for Thanksgiving. He did. Serena was sentenced to 4 years, with eligibility for parole after 2. On the morning of the sentencing, I sat in the courtroom and watched her stand before the judge, and I tried to find something clear in what I felt. Satisfaction seemed too small. Relief seemed too simple. What I actually felt was something closer to sorrow, not for her, not exactly, but for the version of her I had believed in, the one who had remembered the name of my grandson and made coffee the way I liked it and held my hand at a birthday party and made me think the rest of my life might not be as quiet as I'd resigned myself to. That version of her had never existed. I knew that. But grief doesn't always require something real. Sometimes it just requires something you believed in, and I had believed. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into November air, sharp and clean. My daughter was waiting on the steps. She was wearing a green coat I'd bought her for her birthday 2 years ago, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked so much like her mother in that light that it took me a moment. She fell into step beside me without saying anything, the way she always does. We walked to the parking garage. The city was loud around us. Someone was selling roasted nuts from a cart on the corner, and the smell of it was warm and ordinary and good. "What do you want to do now?" my daughter asked. I thought about the lake house, the porch, the way the light comes off the water in December, flat and silver, beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with warmth. I thought about my granddaughter, who was 9 now, and had recently decided she wanted to learn to fish, and had called me twice in 1 week to ask me when we could go. "I want to go fishing," I said. My daughter laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and the sound of it bounced off the concrete walls of the parking garage, and came back to us like something returning from a long way off. I am 67 years old. I have buried a wife I loved for 31 years. I have watched a woman I trusted try to dismantle everything I built. I have had to sit across from my own son and ask a question I was afraid of the answer to. I have learned, later in life than I should have, that loneliness can make a person porous, that grief can open doors you don't know you've left unlocked. But I have also sat on a back porch with my daughter in the November dark and felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Something that doesn't have a clean name, some combination of loss and gratitude, and the particular peace that comes when you are finally, after a long time of not being exactly where you are. My granddaughter and I went fishing the second weekend of December. We drove out to the lake before sunrise and sat in the cold together with thermoses of hot chocolate, and she talked the entire time in the way she does, cycling through every thought she had without pausing to edit any of them, and I sat next to her and listened and watched the line and thought about nothing except this. The cold, the quiet water, the small warm weight of her leaning against my arm. She didn't catch anything. Neither did I. It was the best morning I'd had in years.